Who here has heard of Flagstaff before? A few folks have. Who's aware that it's at 7,000 feet in elevation? So before I took a job out at NAU, it's been a dozen years now, I had no idea that we had 4 seasons. We are forecast to get between about 2 to 3 feet of snow between tonight and Friday afternoon. All right, so I think I'm going to get home tonight. So the title of the presentation, Addressing Bicycle Vehicle Conflicts with Alternative Signal Control Strategies. This was funded by UTC out of Portland State University. They were the prime on it. Sarisha Kurthuri was the prime. I was the NAU PI. And Brendan Russo is a colleague of mine, and he worked on some of the latter parts of this project. So a little bit about NAU. Our main campus is in Flagstaff. We have small campuses across the state. We've got 29,000 or so students statewide, with 22,000 on campus. We've been growing. When I came to NAU in fall of 2007, we had 12,000 students on campus. So we are getting larger. We were founded in 1899 as the Arizona State Teachers College. So we have a distinct focus that's a bit different than ASU and U of A in that we are the accessible institution. We don't have much in the way of entrance standards, so you can take whatever slant you want on that. But we've really focused on undergraduate education. We do have graduate education as part of that. So research is important, but we do not lose sight of our real purpose, which is serving the undergraduate population. Okay. The objectives of this project, we wanted to look at how can we improve the safety / efficiency of bicycles at signalized intersections with signal treatments. Okay? A little bit of an aside on myself as far as doing bicycle research. We talked about this at dinner last night. My personal cylinder count is 22. That's a V8, 2 inline sixes, a snowblower, and a chainsaw. So I'm primarily a vehicular person. I was born and raised at Purdue in research, and we did research on vehicle performance measures. And in the last 5 or 6 years, I've gotten more involved in multimodal performance. So I think I have a little different perspective on this than someone who might be purely involved in the multimodal side of this. I'm going to go back up one slide. So when we did this project, this started in about 2015. There had been some recent work looking at paint markings, other things that can reduce conflicts at signalized intersections. We wanted to look at the signal side of it, so traditional phasing, a leading bike interval, exclusive phasing, and a split leading bike interval. And I'll explain what these LBI mean shortly if you're not familiar with that. Okay. And then we also want to do a field implementation. So the motivation is to avoid this conflict, this right hook conflict, right, where we have the vehicle turning right and the bicycle proceeding through. This can happen when a vehicle overtakes a cyclist. As this is occurring, or it can also happen where we have so the vehicle overtakes the cyclist, or the cyclist can actually overtake the vehicle if the vehicle is queuing to wait for people to cross, or other friction. Right. So there's been limited research on the signal control options to address this. Right. Here's what I'm talking about. This we can probably update later. All right, so this is a mixing zone, and I'll talk about this strategy specifically later. This video is out of New York City, you're looking at the actual conflict when the video plays. Here's the cyclist part in the graininess of the video, and then we're looking at the interaction between that cyclist and this Toyota minivan right here. And that's the right hook conflict that we're talking about. It looks like there were some pleasantries exchanged from the cyclist to the vehicle in that case. Anyway, so the methodology of this project, what's going on out there? So like any good academic project, literature review, and then survey the practitioners to see who knows about this stuff and who's doing it. All right? Do a software-in-the-loop simulation of these alternate control treatments. That was probably the weakest part of this work as far as having usable results for a couple of reasons. And then deploying a treatment or two or three in the field and doing some data collection from that. So these are our project milestones. The project finished about a year or so ago. We have done some work in the last year that was presented at TRB that has kept it current, and we are moving forward with it. But again, just talked about our general process through the project. Our field deployment sites were in the city of Phoenix, the city of Portland, and New York City DOT. So what are these strategies that you see? So the first is a leading bike interval. You may also have heard the term leading pedestrian interval. Who's heard that term before, leading pedestrian? So there's actually one just off campus here. I think it's MacArthur and Figueroa. Has a leading pedestrian interval where they give the pedestrians walk, I think it's about 4 or 5 seconds prior to the vehicles getting green. Okay, it allows the pedestrians to establish themselves out into the crosswalk before the vehicles start to turn across that. Because when there's a very high right turning vehicle volume, it can be challenging for pedestrians just to establish themselves. They can get stuck on the curb and never be able to make it out there to cross. So if we look at that from a bicycle standpoint, these figures are from a Massachusetts DOT guide. So we're looking at, this is the phase indication for pedestrians, bicycles, and motor vehicles. So on the left here, at 1, what we're doing here is we are holding the vehicles and we are giving the bicycles preference. We're giving the bicycles time to start their cross at the intersection. Again, think about what we're trying to avoid here. We're trying to avoid the vehicle turning across the bicycle. Right? So if we can get those bicycles that are queued up at the start of green through, we've avoided the possibility of those conflicts. Right? A split leading bike interval is very similar to an LBI, a leading bike interval, except for in the case of this, we are only holding the right turning traffic. Right? So we're allowing the through vehicles to go along with the bicycles and the pedestrians in this case. Right? The idea is that we can, when I do this, I'm going to increase the delay for all the vehicles. Right? If I do this, I just increase the delay for the right turning vehicles. The through vehicles don't see much of a change in how long they have to wait. The last one is an exclusive bike phase. This is very similar to an exclusive pedestrian phase, a Barnes dance, ped scramble, whatever you want to call it. Jen, we walked through one right in front of the shrine earlier today. And the idea here is that we hold all the traffic. And again, this is just looking at this bicycle movement here. In reality, you would allow all bicycle movements to go during this. All right, but so this separates all those conflicts between bicycles and motor vehicles in time. The problem being that this does increase delay for all users, including the bicycles. Right? If we add an extra phase to the structure, to the ring structure of a traffic signal, it causes more delay for everybody involved. The last treatment that was part of this, it isn't really a signal strategy, but came about because we had access to the video and we had the funds to analyze it, was that of a mixing zone. Right? The idea with a mixing zone is that we move this conflict point back from the stop line of the intersection or into the intersection and allow the different users a chance to kind of sort themselves out before they get to the intersection. Survey was the first part of this. We had a total of 69 respondents. Again, this was a practitioner survey. We had 65 identify themselves as engineers, 18% as planners, researchers, and a few others. We asked of their awareness of split LBI. Now, this survey was done in about 2016, so I think this is likely shifted this way, I hope, by now. About half knew of it. As far as those that actually implemented it, the different strategies, we had about 25 or 30 that did protected bike phases, LPIs, that's leading pedestrian interval, and then leading bike interval, we only had 10 that did that. These don't need to add up to the number. They can do multiple ones. Split LBI, just a couple of them, and then a number of about a third of the respondents didn't do any of that. The next step in this was to do a simulation, and the idea of the simulation was we wanted to see what the impact was on the delay of all users for the various strategies. Right? We did this just prior to this project, we did a very similar project on pedestrian strategies at signalized intersections, and it was actually very, very useful. This didn't work out very well as far as the simulation for a couple of reasons. One being that the way that bicycles queue up at an intersection when we did this, we used VSIM for this, didn't really match reality. I mean, you think about if you have 8 bicycles going up to a bike box, right? They're not going to stack 8 behind each other. They're going to kind of queue up into a group and go forward like that. And so at the time we did this, and I'm unable to say if VSIM has changed that because I haven't done work in that space since, that was one of our issues. So we did a software-in-the-loop simulation with an AZT traffic controller. Who knows what this term is? All right, we got 2. This one? All right, excellent. So if you'd like to explain the AZT, no. So AZT is a traffic controller. It's used to determine how long each direction is going to get green, yellow, and red for all the users at a signalized intersection. Software in the loop simply means that I have my simulation software, which is VSIM. I actually have a plugin inside of that runs the software of that AZT controller. So as opposed to using an embedded traffic controller inside the simulation, which likely will not have the same features as a field traffic controller, I can do everything in that software, in that simulation, on that AZT that I can do out in the field. Right? There are a couple of different controllers that have that available. So if you're doing any kind of simulation in transportation engineering in the VSIM space, it's very desirable to use this because it takes any concerns about the compatibility of what you did in the simulation versus what you can do in the field away because you're using field hardware. Okay, so reason number 2 why the simulation wasn't the best is that we actually had to make modifications to the geometry of our corridor in Portland. Didn't even talk about that. Our simulation was in Portland, east of downtown on 122nd and Division. Because Portland has good street markings out here, right? So in this so on the left side, this is our real-world geometry. We see that the bike lane is between the right turn lane and the through lane. That's where we want that. We don't want the right turning vehicles to have to cross the bicycles. And in the westbound direction, we don't have a bike lane here. Okay? So what we did in the simulation, we changed the bike lane to put it outside of the right turn lane, which is something we wouldn't do, but we wanted to have that conflict occur in simulation. And again, when you think about the simulation results, we're not trying to validate this to the real world. We're just looking for differences between strategies within the same simulation space. Okay? And then westbound, we changed this into a combined through right with the bike lane to the right of it to see that conflict. We collected field data. There's a firm called Quality Counts that we paid to do this. Our pedestrian volumes were not coded for directions, just a kind of a note. Our bike volumes were extremely low. Okay? Portland is somewhat of a cyclist mecca when you're closer to downtown. This is far enough east that there is weren't the number of bicycles in the real world data to give you any reasonable interaction between the different modes. Right? So what we did was we ran the bikes in 10 different sets of the simulation as a percentage of the mode share. Right? So what we would do is for each one of these different data sets, we would have more and more bicycles to help us get a little larger set of interactions. Again, this is a comparative simulation. We're not looking to validate this to any real world deployment. Okay? So this is a diagram of the intersection phasing at the intersection. The only thing you need to think about if you don't understand what this ring numbering is that this phase 6 is the westbound movement and phase 2 is the eastbound movement. And this diagram will be up in the upper right-hand corner as I talk about some of the results so you can kind of think about the direction we're looking at. All right. So the first, we look at the leading bike interval. And this leading bike interval is compared against a base case. Right? And the base case is just a coordinated timing plan with vehicles being coordinated in the east and westbound direction along Division Avenue. Right? So we look at the through movement, LBI delay, and this is for the vehicles, And we see that we do increase delay about 5 seconds or so, which makes sense because our LBI was a 5-second delay. Right? For the right turn delay, we see an increase in delay. Actually, excuse me, not much of this. Apologies, I think I have a timing on this I didn't think I had. Going back, we saw an increase in the right turn for the vehicle delay as well. So for bicycle delay, we didn't see much of a change over this. And again, these results, in my opinion, are kind of weak as far as what I can discern from this. It's kind of showing you what I would expect to happen when I run this simulation, but there isn't anything terribly useful to glean from this. I just present this as part of the entirety of the study. The split LBI, again, now we're looking at phase 2. We're looking at this direction here. Vehicle delay. This is the case where we're just holding the right turning vehicles. The through vehicles are allowed to go. With the bicycles, we see that the through vehicle delay doesn't really change, but we have an increase in right turn delay. Again, it's what we would expect to see. The bike volumes don't change that very much. And as far as bicycle delay, we see a decrease in the bicycle delay at lower percentages, but at higher percentages. Again, this is a coordinated arterial, right? So that means that we're setting green times artificially to move vehicles up and down that corridor. When we have very low numbers of bicycles based upon when they arrive at the intersection, really changes the amount of delay they have. When you only have a handful of bikes, you get numbers that look like this, right? So these are all things you should think about when you run a simulation to think about what the results actually mean, because this doesn't mean a whole lot of anything, right, as I presented to a camera. Anyway, so looking at the exclusive bike phase for vehicle delay, again, this is when we hold all the movements at the intersection and let the bicycles go. This is bike delay. We see base case versus exclusive bike phase. We see an increase in delay in most of the cases. There are a couple of that are lower, but again, we're looking at when those bicycles arrive during that cycle. Then we see something similar for the bicycle delay. All right. I'm going to get to what I think is the real meat of this presentation. Summary for the simulation. We saw just what we expected to happen based upon how those strategies operate. The leading bike interval, we increased delay for through and right turning vehicles. Split LBI, we increased delay for the right turning vehicles, but not for the through vehicles. And then for the bike phase, we increased delay for everyone. All right, the field evaluation. Our initial intent was to do a nice, clean before and after study. Right? We have a specific intersection approach. We collect some data about the amount of conflicts that we see between the vehicles and the bicycles. We make 1 or 2 changes to it, so we've only changed a little bit out there, and then we collect data again, and we try to develop some sort of numerical guidance from that. It didn't happen. Right? We tried the city of Phoenix, which I'll show you that in a little bit. We did do that, but over 2 weeks, we didn't have any bicycle motor vehicle conflicts. Right? The other locations, city of Portland and New York City, while they made changes to it, there were a lot of changes at the same time. Right? And anyone who's tried to run a statistical comparison before knows that when you only have 2 sites and you change 7 things, there's no way you can pull out any one of those individual metrics or changes and point to it with any degree of certainty. So we analyzed a number of different sites and provide some qualitative comments on this with the idea of moving forward, trying to provide some sort of numerical guidance for when to use a certain countermeasure to reduce bicycle motor vehicle conflicts. So the metrics we looked at whether or not there was an incident, and we classified that as the bicycle and the motor vehicle crossing paths temporally within 5 seconds of each other, and I have a little figure, I'll show that shortly. Post-encroachment time, I'll explain that shortly as well. Time since bicycle vehicle green, how long from when the bike green came on did the interaction happen, the speed, and whether or not there was an evasive action. Okay. Post-encroachment time, who's heard that term before? Nobody? Excellent. All right, so what post-encroachment time is, it's a measure of the seriousness of an encounter between 2 separate users, right? How do we calculate it? So we're looking at vehicle 1, vehicle 2. This vehicle heads west and crosses that space. And post-encroachment time is the time from when this vehicle leaves the space to this vehicle arriving at the space, right? So you can imagine if this is a very small value, that's a very serious encounter. You were very close. There was very close to actually the two users making contact. If it's a larger value, not quite as dangerous. So one of the previous literatures that we looked up classified the duration of the PET value from no interaction to very dangerous interaction. One thing about this is, do you think this is the same for Flagstaff, Arizona versus Metro LA versus Portland versus New York City? It's definitely not. Definitely not. So something else to think about as you look at the results of this work. Right. So here's an example of one of the videos that we used. This is one in New York City. I can't remember offhand which intersection this is, but we're looking at this left turning movement and those bicycles. All right. So right there, I'm not sure if you all caught that. And there's another one later in the video I'll show specifically, but if you watch this, I think it's a Volvo SUV, turns left across, right, but this SUV, and this cyclist. It's a pretty good evasive action on the bicyclist. Nice, right? And actually later in the video, let's see. All right, so you're watching this vehicle, and there's a pedestrian, and watch this cab, this Prius. And they actually stand there for a while and discuss things. You can imagine what's going on there. So, and then there was another interaction right there with that Windstar turning left. So there's a lot going on in the video, right? So the way we reduce this is we have undergraduate researchers in an office setting. So we have this video. This video came from New York City. We never visited New York City during the duration of the study, but our colleagues there provided us with video from various sites to do this at, right? And we developed a spreadsheet where we identified different things based upon the timestamp of the video and what we could see between the interactions, right? So in this example here, there's this left-turning truck, which this just scares me because we killed a couple of cyclists in Flagstaff in the last 4 or 5 years with trucks like this turning across them, right? So this is really turning left, and you'll see there's a cyclist behind here as we forward through in the video, right? Here's the cyclist right here. Here's the truck. So what we're doing is we're looking at the timestamp on the video from when each of those leaves this spot right here. Okay, so going back one frame, the truck was there at 7:06 or left it at 7:06. The cyclist left it at 7:10. That gives us a time difference of 4 seconds. And then when we actually look at the PET value from between these two, it's 0.15 seconds. That's a very close, very dangerous interaction, right? We also looked at the speed of both the bicycles and the vehicle. The intent was to, we didn't use this actually much in the analysis, but the intent was to look at severity of that, but we didn't get towards that point. So we used different landmarks on the screen to do that. And we also looked at when did this interaction happen measured to when the bicycle green started. Because if you think about releasing vehicles and releasing bicycles with those conflicts, you can start to try to bunch your bicycles up at a certain point in the cycle to avoid those conflicts. Because it's similar to getting, when you have a large volume of pedestrians, cars see them better than just one pedestrian, or cars see a group of bikes better than just one bicycle. So there's less chance of a conflict happening. All right, moving on. So our data overview, we ended up analyzing 7 different sets of data. Okay, we had our 2 places where we actually had data before and after. One was 12th and Campbell. This was in Phoenix. We went from concurrent, so just serving the bicycles with the green ball, to a leading bike interval. And then in New York City, we went from concurrent with LPI, and I'll show you what I mean by this shortly with the site, to a split LBI. So on the surface, this seems like a really good idea. We can do a comparison, but they also changed where the bike lane was. They changed coordination of the bikes up and down the street. There were just a number of things that happened, right? So looking at a summary of the data analysis, again, the guidance that I can provide from this, or this work provides, is really qualitative because there are so many differences between the sites that trying to develop any kind of numerical guidance is not very fruitful. But what we looked at, we have our hours of video, our treatment, total number of bicycles, total number of motor vehicles. This is vehicles that turned either across the bicycle lane or were in the adjacent through lane, right? Total number of incidents, so this is an interaction within 5 seconds, right? Percentage of bicycles involved in an incident, so this would be 38% of the 1,166 bicycles were involved in an incident in this time period. Collisions without evasive action, so this is the cyclist or their motor vehicle actually doing something to avoid the collision. And near misses is a somewhat qualitative measure that our student worker identified from when there was a very last second maneuver for one of the participants to not hit the other one. Yeah, no, please.
It says number of collisions without evasive action, meaning there were 197 collisions?
So the collision would have happened had a user not made an evasive action. Right. So the split LBI, right? So we're looking at 1st Avenue and 61st Street in New York City. Here's my bicycle lane. Here's my left turn lane for vehicles. Then I have 3 through lanes for vehicles, and I also have a transit lane on the far side. If I summarize the data for it, this information was all on that summary chart before. If I actually look at the incidents for this, we didn't have good videos of this site. If we break down the percentage of incidents, we had a total of 445 incidents. About 40% of bicycles were involved in an incident with a motor vehicle. About 60% of those would be considered very dangerous. So that's less than 1.5 seconds. Right? Thinking back to that slide. So how do you improve this? Try to shift things down here somehow, or certainly reducing the overall number of incidents. Right? All right, so we also looked at when the incident happened in relation to when the bicycle green started, right? So this had a leading interval of 8 seconds. So the bikes had 8 seconds to go before the vehicles. So we really shouldn't see much going on here. But then we also see a pretty healthy peak about 10 seconds after the vehicles are allowed to go. So this tells me that I could look at the coordination of cyclists down that corridor and possibly do something to move this up so that they're reaching the intersection during that protected part of it. Right. One of the challenges of trying to deal with these conflicts with the signal strategy is that it's really challenging to deal with one during what we call stale green, when it's been green for a number of seconds, right? Because we can't, with our control strategy, we can't control starting and stopping vehicles or cyclists when they both had green for 10 or 15 seconds. We're kind of at the mercy of what's going on out there. But that will be one strategy for that. Next intersection, this is the split LBI. So here we're going to hold the right turning traffic while we allow the through vehicles to go and the cyclists to go. This was the after case for our one place where we had before and after. Here is a picture of it, and we'll show ideally how things should operate. Okay, we have our cyclist and our taxi cab. All right. Seemed to work fairly well. The cyclist was really trucking, but the car paid attention, so it worked out well. Here's a situation where we have box truck, and we have cyclists moving around the box truck. One thing that we know is part of the equation is what's going on in this crosswalk right here. right? What's that pedestrian volume? And we did not account for that in this work. We have another project that we think will be funded shortly, fingers crossed, that will look at doing that. But we know that's part of the equation. So this is a summary of interactions at that intersection with the split LBI. We had only about 17% of the vehicles, of bicycles involved in an incident versus 38% at the other locations. This one feels a bit safer. I hesitate to ever say it is a bit safer because you never really know. But based upon this study, that feels like this is a little better place to cycle through. We got a little bit of peaking here with the conflicts, but that's pretty late into the green. But again, you do see possibly an opportunity to kind of fit those cyclists earlier to avoid that conflict. Our overall findings for the split LBI, we had significantly higher conflicts at that first intersection. We had higher levels of turn volumes there. We had a downhill grade, and we also had that pedestrian crossing, and what's the impact of that? So we can increase the lead interval, we can coordinate with adjacent signals, and if turn volumes are really high, we can separate the phases, right? But again, you're trying to balance these objectives between all the different user groups at the intersection. So taking time out of the vehicle phases to give it strictly to the bikes may or may not be workable. Concurrent with LBI, this is the before of the 6th Avenue and 23rd Street, and so you see a number of things happen. The bike lane was shifted. And this actually is really interesting because if you can see this here, and you can't real well, but that's the orange hand right there for the pedestrian signal. And I'll call it out as it changes. Let me go to the next. So this is the start of a cycle. So right now it's don't walk, and wait for it. Turns to walk. LPI, all the vehicles are held, and all the bikes go with the pedestrians. So it really is functioning as a leading bike interval, a de facto leading bike interval. So here's an example of a number of bicycles and vehicles interacting. Here we've got a cab that's blocking the bike lane, trying to pull out, and then turns left across the bike lane. And you also have interaction with the pedestrians and the bicycles going through here, and having that curb parking kind of encourages that because the peds are going to step as far out as possible to see what's going on. So you have some friction there as well. Right. In this case, we had 22% of the bicycles were involved in an incident. About 30% of these will be considered to be very dangerous interactions. We've got a comparative slide a bit later. And here's where we've plotted those based upon when the green interval started. And again, we see that similar opportunity there. This being the before case, this was the corridor where one of the changes that was made was they actually changed when they released the cyclists upstream to try and concentrate them during the lead interval. For our before case, the concurrent with the LBI, we had issues with the taxi drivers. There was a large queue being built up, and the right turn vehicles backed up the queue because they didn't have an exclusive turn lane. This was addressed for the after. This was addressed in the after, which you saw that just shortly before. Mixing zone. Okay, so one location in New York where we had a mixing zone, we're looking at this direction, and this video was the original video I showed to highlight what that conflict looked like. Okay. Again, here's that same location. We're just looking at the start of the cycle here. All right. So here are the bicyclists coming through. The vehicles should be paying attention to what's going on to avoid that conflict. And again, the point, or the desire of this treatment is that you're moving this conflict point a little bit upstream so these users can figure out who should have the right of way before the actual point where the vehicle is trying to make the turn. Right? Here's an example of a near miss. This was actually the original video that we showed with a little bit of interaction. Okay. About 18% at this location. Right, so we've had a couple of sites that all hovered around 20% or so. Severity, about 40% or so, very dangerous also versus dangerous. And again, this is New York City. There's a lot of people there, right? So they may not consider this to be as bad a situation as we might, based upon whatever our requirements for personal space might be. No leading interval here. This is our plot of when these happened versus the start of a green. So we're kind of all over the place in this location. Notes from this mixing zone. There was a lot of merging into the mixing zone at the last second. We had an issue with the pedestrian standing in the bicycle lane. This bike lane was against the curb. Right, so that was an issue as far as causing some friction for the cyclists. This site, another mixing zone site. This is in Portland, Oregon. So different location, different population. Right, video is a little bit dark, but here's a bus, and there's a cyclist coming through. We'll see if we can see it. Apologies, this came up much brighter on my screen, but you see the bus is waiting for the cyclist, and the cyclist will pull through. And then there's another example of the same site, okay, where the cyclist just weaves his or her way into that stream of traffic. Okay. Has anyone ever ridden a bike around Portland, Oregon? Anyone? It's really an interesting place because there's such different cultures. So like when you're in the downtown area, the bus is always going to wait, right? The people are going to wait. But when you're out east towards Gresham in the suburbs, it's like driving around rural Arizona, right? Or rural California where the bicycle goes, yeah, it's okay you're there, but I don't really want you there. Whereas in downtown, it's very polite. Everyone waits for the cyclist. It's really a different experience. Right? So this site, we had about 20% of the cyclists were involved in an interaction between the motor vehicle. About a third or so between very dangerous, and mild interaction. This is pretty flat when these happened based upon when the green started, right? And notes to take away from this, again, we see the vehicles merging at the last second. The bikes tried to merge into the middle of the mixing zone as soon as possible, just because they're more, our interpretation is you're more visible. Cars can see you better out there. And then the bus stop caused some additional friction here. Overall findings, little confusion observed in the mixing zone about who's supposed to go when. Previous research by a Portland State researcher found that only about 60% bicycles correctly used the mixing zone. Our percent of conflicts were comparable between the mixing zone and our other locations. Okay. Here's City of Phoenix. 11 minutes, right on time. Okay, we're looking at this southbound approach here. Right turning vehicles and the bike lane. I put this in here to show all the work that the City of Phoenix did to make this a go. Right, this is their first bicycle signal within the city, and I think we all kind of knew going in after we chose the site that we weren't going to see a whole lot of action, right? But this gave them the ability to say, yes, we've already done this, and it's performed fairly well to allow them to deploy further bike signals. The City of Phoenix has been working very hard in the last X number of years, 5 or 6 or 7 years or so, to improve operations for non-motorized users, but they're up against quite a challenge. Who's driven around Phoenix? All right. If you've driven in Vegas, it's very similar. Mile spacing, 45-mile-an-hour speed limits. So those the people that do ride bicycles are typically what we call vehicular cyclists, in that they're okay with riding with the traffic stream and in dealing with those interactions. But if we really want to increase mode share, we have to improve the comfort of the ride. And that's where bike boulevards, which is one of theirs, comes into play. So they changed out the cabinet, they changed out the controller, they put in some detection, all this to make this work. And this is our site. Here's our bike signal. We've got 2 signal heads. We've got some signage. Our camera was mounted to a luminaire arm just up street. excellent view. Week before, week after, 86 bikes in 5 days, no incidents or conflicts. After 74 bikes over 7 days, no incidents or conflicts. Okay? If you go this way about half mile or so, the road turns back to the north because there's a canal that runs here. So there's just not that many vehicles turning right. So we weren't surprised that that was what we found out. There was one video that one of the City of Phoenix folks sent us. And what you're looking at, this is a cyclist perspective. Here's our bike signal here. Or that's our ped signal. Here's our bike signal up here. And at right about the 1 minute mark. All right. The bike goes green. And the vehicle runs the red light. All right. I mean, most of us driving, we've all done something similar at some point in time where you're looking at the next, like maybe you see it at a diamond interchange at a freeway where you're looking at the next signal up and it changes and you hit the gas and you catch yourself, of course, because none of us would ever do that. This is other people. All right. So here's a summary of all the data. I won't dwell too much on this because we already I talked about these individually. Again, we had one location with that split LBI where we had a lot of incidents. Everything else was around 20%. Again, I stress how challenging it is to make any numerical comparison between these different sites because there are so many different factors at each one. Okay. Again, looking at severity, we can look at the comparison across the sites too, but the same caveat does apply as far as so many different things going on. So our goal at the start of this project was to provide guidance to practitioners as far as which strategy to employ with the hope of having some numbers to back it up, but it ended up being very qualitative. So if we look at bicycle volumes and we look at vehicle turning volumes, we can go ahead and if both of them are low, we can serve the bicycles and motor vehicles concurrently, right? If we're a little bit further up, a little bit higher, perhaps a mixing zone is where to go. Higher further, we look at split LBI or an LBI. Again, as we get to more and more conflicting movements, we're trying to split those movements in time. Right? And then exclusive bike phase would be the point where we would get to, well, we really have that large volume of conflicts. And this can be either that the bike volumes are choking off the vehicles or the vehicles are choking off the bikes. It can be either way. Right? If we rank these by vehicular efficiency, right, the concurrent phase is going to be the most efficient for the vehicles, least amount of additional delay to deal with the bicycles, and the exclusive bike phase is going to be the least efficient, again, because we're making everybody wait while we serve the vehicles. If we rank these by turning volumes, okay, if we have high turning volumes, exclusive bike phase is where we're going to want to be to separate those in time. If we have low turning volumes, we're looking at those concurrent service. So all of this was from the NHTSA project, and this here is something we used PSR 9 money for with undergraduate interns to develop for TRB this past year. And the idea was to actually get towards having some sort of numerical guidance towards when to implement a certain strategy. So we took the data from this study, analyzed another site or two, and what you see on here is on the y-axis, you see predicted bicycle vehicle conflicts per hour. Okay, so we actually took some of the settings or some of the information at the sites, the conflicts that we saw, volumes, things like that, and attempted to, we did run a model, right, to get some trend lines. So each one of these, so this is through bicycles per hour on the x-axis. And then each one of these is the trend lines is the number of turning vehicles per hour, right? So this is the number of vehicles per hour turning across those through bicycles, 25 down here all the way up to 150 up here. And you look for a break point. At what point is your agency comfortable with the number of conflicts per hour? Is it 20? Is it 40? Is it 60? At what point do you decide that we need to do something to address this, right? It can be any of the treatments that we talked about, whatever might work for a given site, whatever you might be able to sell politically to the users out there. But we see that once we get over about 100 turning vehicles per hour, maybe a fourth line up, we start to see a large increase in the number of conflicts. Interestingly enough, there was some guidance in the Massachusetts DOT that the authors had. It was cocktail napkin guidance, right? They had just kind of, based on their judgment of operations over the years, this is what they decided was a good guidance, and our values came remarkably close to that based upon this, right? So, conclusions and recommendations. Got about 3 minutes out of my 50 left, right? So again, already talked about much of this concurrent is best suited for when we have low bicycle and low turning volumes. We move up to LBI, split LBI. We want to split those in time, split being more efficient, but this will require additional signage without a right turn on red prohibition. Right? We move that right hook potential towards the stale green, and coordinating the bikes can further reduce the risk of that conflict later in green. Bike phase, lots of delay, removes the conflicts. Mixing zones, the application is somewhat unclear from this work. Again, we saw some confusion, maybe best suited for medium to low bicycle and vehicle volumes. Future work, right? We want to supplement the surrogate data with actual crash data. Looking historically at the sites, this requires a time horizon, both then and now, to actually do a reasonable analysis of this. Determine volume thresholds for application of various treatments. That was the plot with all the lines on it, that is actually ongoing. Examine the gap acceptance of cyclists in various cities and relate to the perception of safety. So this gets to that, is 1.5 seconds a serious PET value here versus New York City versus Flagstaff versus somewhere else. And then quantify the impact of pedestrian volumes on the strategies. Right? If we have a very high ped movement that everyone's trying to cross, it's going to increase the number of conflicts for that location. All right, so these are all the partners on here. Okay. Portland State, NHTSA funded it, Trek, New York City, Portland, City of Phoenix. Flagstaff was here for emotional support. We were going to do deployment with them, but it just didn't work out. Right. And then I presume our presentation will be available somewhere, but here's our contact information. If you have questions, please ask me now. Send me an email. I have business cards here as well. So, all right.